Masechet Rosh Hashana, Daf Bet, Amud Bet, following the schedule of Oraysa.com. We will begin in the last few lines of Daf Bet Amud Aleph. Tanu Rabbanan. Melech she'amad be'esrim v'tish'a be'adar. If you have a king who took up the reins of kingship on the 29th of Adar, Kevan shehigia echad benisan, once it's already the first of Nisan, alta lo shana, it's already considered for him 1 year, even though he was only king for 1 day. But once it already became the new year on echad benisan, it's as if by the fact that he became king on the 29th of Adar, it's as if he was king for an entire year. ואם לא עמד אלא באחד בניסן, אין מונין לו שנה עד שיגיע ניסן אחר. If he only became king on the first of Nisan, then we don't count for him a second year of his reign until the following Nisan. אמר מר, מלך שעמד ב-29 באדר, כיוון שהגיע אחד בניסן עלתה לו שנה, כמשמע לן דניסה ראש השנה למלכים. From this Braita, we have a proof that Echad Benisan is Rosh Hashana LaMelachim. That is when we begin counting the year, a new year for a king. By the fact that if he took up the reins by the fact that the Braita says that if he took up the reins on the 29th of Adar, that on the 1st of Nisan, that's already considered for him a second year. That 1 day that he was king on the 29th of Adar, it's considered for him an entire year. Kamash Malan, Denisan, Rosh Hashana LaMelachim, Veyom Echad B'Shana Chashuv Shana, and 1 day of the year is considered like an entire year. Ve'im lo amad ela be'echad benisan, if he only took up the reins as king on the 1st of Nisan be'echad benisan, en monin lo shana ad shiagia Nisan acher. The Braita taught us that we don't consider it for him an entire year until the following Nisan. We don't consider it for him 1 year until the following Nisan. Pshita, that's obvious. What's the Mishnah coming to teach me? What's the Braita coming to teach me with that clause? Lo. Tzricha de'imenu aleha me'adar. What happened here? That they appointed him as king. He was voted as king in the month of Adar. Mahu detema nimnule tachtin shnin. I might have thought that if he's appointed as king in the month of Adar, he did not assume the role as king. He did not assume the kingship, but rather he was voted in. He was appointed as king. Therefore, when Echad ben Nisan comes, that should already be considered his second year. Kamash Malan. No, it's not enough that they voted him in, or they appointed him. He has to actually take up the kingship. He has to be coronated as king. Only when he's coronated as king in the month of Adar do we consider it for him as 1 year, and therefore by Echad ben Nisan that will be considered his second year. But if he was only appointed as king, he was only voted in, and he only took up his kingship in the month of Nisan, we only start counting the years of the reign of him being king when he actually assumes the position, not when he was appointed or voted in. Tanu Rabbanan, a Braita, Met be'Adar, a king died in the month of Adar, ve'amad acher tachtav, and another king assumed the reins of kingship be'Adar, also in the month of Adar. So a king, the previous king passed away in the month of Adar, and the new king took up the reins of kingship in the month of Adar. Monin shana lazeh velazeh. We consider it as a year for the previous king who passed away. It could be considered like a year for his reign, and it could also be considered like a year for the new king. Meaning, we're going to see for legal documents. For legal documents, you can count this. You can count it according to the years of the reign of the previous king who passed away, or you can count it as the years of the new king who was as the years from the reign of the new king who took up the kingship. Met benisan ve'amad acher tachtav benisan. If the king passed away in the month of Nisan, and another king took up the position in the month of Nisan, another person took up the position as king in the month of Nisan, monin shana lazeh v'lazeh. So too in that case, we say that that year could be counted as a year in the reign of the previous king who passed away and as a year in the reign of the king who took over. Met be'adar ve'amad acher tachtav. If a king passed away in the month of Adar, and another took over, ve'amad acher tachtav b'Nisan, another took over from him in the month of Nisan, monin rishona lerishon ve'shniya lesheni. We count the first year, meaning the previous year for the previous king, and the second year for the second king. Amar mar. Met be'adar ve'amad acher tachtav be'adar. If you have a scenario where a king passed away in the month of Adar, and another was appointed as king and another assumed the position as king in the month of Adar, monin shana lazeh ve'lazeh. We count that year. It can be counted as a year for the reign of the previous king, and at the same time, it could also be counted as a year for the current king that took over. Pshita. That's obvious. What's the Mishnah coming to teach me? What's the Braita coming to teach me? Mahu detema, I would have thought, shata lebeitre lo maninan. We don't count 1 year for two monarchs. We don't count, you can't count the same year for two kings. Kamash malan, that if you have a king that passed away in the month of Adar, and another king that assumed the position of king in the month of Adar, you can count this year both at the same time, both for the previous king and the current king. For legal documents, you can count this year. If you choose to put the reign of the previous king, the years of the reign of the previous king, you can count this year towards the reign of the previous king. Or, once again, for legal documents, you could count the reign of the new king this year as part of the reign of the new king. Met benisan ve'amad acher tachtav. If a king passed away in the month of Nisan, and another assumed the position in the month of Nisan, monin shana lazeh ve'lazeh. We count the year both. The year can be counted both for the reign as part of the years of the reign of the previous king, and also as part of the years of the new king. Pshita, that's obvious. Mahu detema, I would have thought, why does the Braita need to teach me this? Ki amrinan yom echad b'shana hashuv shana besof shana, aval b'tchilat hashana lo amrinan kamash malan. I would have thought as follows. Only when a king is, for example, if you have a situation where a king is appointed as a new king in the month of Adar, and then comes Echad Benisan. Let's say he was appointed a new king on the 29th of Adar, and then comes Echad Be'adar. Only then do we say that 1 day is considered like an entire year. And when Echad Benisan comes, that's already considered the second year of his reign, even though he's only been king for 1 day. However, if you have a king that was king all the way and he passed away Echad Benisan, maybe in that case we don't consider it as a year towards his reign. Kamash malan, that even if he passed away Echad Benisan, he's only 1 day into the month of Nisan, that is still considered as a year for him. Once again, mahu detema ki amrinan yom echad b'shana. When do we say that 1 day is considered like an entire year for his reigning as king? Ki amrinan yom echad b'shana hashuv shana besof hashana. That's if he became king at the end of the year. If he became king, for example, on the 29th of Adar, then comes Echad Benisan. That 1 day is considered like an entire year of his reign, and Echad Benisan is beginning the second year. Aval b'tchilat hashana lo amrinan. But if you have a king who was already king, and he was king into the month of Nisan, and he passed away perhaps we don't say that being king for one day at the beginning of the year is considered like an entire year. Kamash Malan, that no, even if he was only king for one day at the beginning of the year, that one day is considered like an entire year, and we can count it towards his years as reign as king. Met be'adar ve'amad acher tachtav benisan, if a king passed away in the month of Adar, ve'amad acher tachtav benisan, and another king assumed the position of king in Nisan, monin rishona la rishon ushniya la sheni. What's the halacha? That the previous year, the first year, is considered as part of the years of the reign of the previous king, of the first king, and the second year after Echad Ben Nisan, that is considered as a year for the current king, for the second king. Pshita, that's obvious. Lo tzricha de'imnu aleha me'adar. Why do we need this clause in the Braita? That they appointed him. He was chosen to be king in the month of Adar. Umelech ben Melech, and he's the son of the king. Umelech ben Melechu. Mahu detema, I would have thought, nimnule taktin shnin kamash malan. I would have thought that, look, since he was already chosen, he was appointed as king in the month of Adar, even though he only assumed the position in the month of Nisan, that's already considered his second year because they appointed him as king in the month of Adar. Kamash malan, that's not the way it works. Even though he was appointed to be king in the month of Adar, we do not count that. We do not count that as a year, as part of his reign. He actually has to assume the position in order for us to count it as a year of his reign. So since he only assumed the position in the month of Nisan, then we only consider from beginning from Nisan as part of the years of his reign. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, minayin la melachim she'en monin lam ela minisan. What is the source? How do we know that we only count the years of the reign of a king beginning in the month of Nisan, from the first of Nisan? What is the source for that? Shene'emar, the pasuk says, Vayhi bishmonim shana ve'arba me'ot shana latzet bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim bashana harevi'id bechodesh ziv hu hachodesh hasheni lemelech Shlomo al Yisrael. We see from that pasuk is talking, the pasuk says it was 480 years when Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim, in the fourth year, in the second month of the fourth year of Shlomo HaMelech's reign of his kingship. Makish Malchut Shlomo leYetziat Mitzrayim. In the same pasuk, we are comparing the kingship, the years of Shlomo HaMelech's reign. We compare the years of Shlomo HaMelech's reign to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Ma Yetziat Mitzrayim min Nisan, af Malchut Shlomo min Nisan. Since we have Yetziat Mitzrayim and the years of the reign of Shlomo in the same pasuk, the same way the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the years that we're counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim, we count from the month of Nisan, so too the years of a king. When do we begin counting the years of the reign of a king? We begin counting it from the month of Nisan. Once again, why? Because it says Yetziat Mitzrayim, the years from when Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, and the years of the reign of Shlomo in the same pasuk. So the same way that the years of that Bnei Yisrael left, the years from when Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, we count from Nisan. So too we count the years of the reign of a king from the month of Nisan. V'yetziat Mitzrayim. Now the Gemara asks, V'yetziat Mitzrayim gufa minalan de minisan minyanan. How do we know that we count the years from when Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, that we count those years according to the month of Nisan, that Nisan begins a new year? Dilma, perhaps we count it from Tishrei. Maybe we're saying the years that from the years that Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, we're counting according to the month of Tishrei. These years are calculated, are counted according to the month of Tishrei, not according to the month of Nisan. Dilma mi Tishrei minyanan. Lo salka daitach. The Gemara says not to say that. Why? Dichtiv. Vaya'al Aharon HaKohen el hor hahar. Al pi Hashem vayamot sham bishanat ha'arba'im latzet bnei Yisrael meretz Mitzrayim bechodesh hachamishi be'echad lachodesh. The pasuk says that Aharon HaKohen passed away in the 40th year after Bnei Israel left Egypt, on the first day of the 5th month, the month of Av, first day of the 5th month. Uktiv, and we have another pasuk. Vahi b'arba'im shana b'ashtei asar chodesh b'echad lachodesh diber Moshe. We have another pasuk that says, in the 40th year, in the 11th month, Moshe Rabbeinu, on the first of the month, Moshe Rabbeinu began to speak to Bnei Israel. Mi dekai be'ah vekari le'shenat arba'im. Since this entire incident happened in the month of Av, this that Aaron passed away, happened in the month of Av. Vekari le'shnat arba'im. And the pasuk says, this was in the 40th year. So we're in the month of Av in the 40th year. Vekai Beshevat. And when Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech to Am Yisrael, his final speech, that was in the month of Shevat. Vekari le Shenat Arba'im. We're also calling that the 40th year. Miklal de Rosh Hashana lav Tishrehu. It must be that the beginning of the year is not in the month of Tishrei. Why? Because if we're saying it can't be that Aharon passed away in the month of Av in the 40th year, and Moshe Rabbeinu was addressing Bnei Israel and Shevat in the 40th year, unless you say that the years are calculated, that the years that Am Yisrael left Egypt are calculated according to the month of Nisan. Because if you say that they're calculated according to the month of Tishrei, it's going to be that Aharon passed away in the 40th year, and Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Am Yisrael in the 41st year. It has to be that we're calculating the years that Bnei Israel left Egypt from the month of Nisan. Being it's from the month of Nisan, this that Aharon passed away in the month of Av, and then Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, it's possible for all of that to have happened in the 40th year. But if you say that it happened, if you say that the month of Tishrei is the beginning of the year, that's going to turn out that Aharon passed away in the month of Av in the 40th year, and really Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, which comes after Tishrei, in the 41st year. And so therefore it has to be that the beginning of the year is the month of Nisan for both Aharon to pass away and Moshe Rabbeinu to address Bnei Israel both in the same year. Bishlema Heich Mefarish liyetziat Mitzrayim. I understand regarding the pasuk of Aharon that you have to explain that as 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Elahai. But regarding the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the 40th year, he began his speech in the 11th month of the 40th year in Shevat. Mimai de Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why do we have to explain that pasuk that it's 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim? Dilma, maybe it means that it's 40 years from the building of the Mishkan. If we look at that pasuk, just because each pasuk says 40 years, it doesn't mean that it has to be 40 years from the same start date. It could be by the pasuk of Aaron, it literally says, Vayal Aaron HaKohen el hochach al pi Hashem, vayamot sham b'shenat ha'arba'im latzet b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Therefore, in that pasuk, I'm forced to calculate 40 years from when Bnei Yisrael left Egypt. But when it says 40 years by the pasuk of Moshe Rabbeinu addressing Bnei Israel in the 11th month, it says nothing about it being 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim. All it says is 40 years. So maybe we can say as follows. Maybe we can say that by Aharon we are forced to say it's 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the pasuk that says 40 years that after 40 years Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel, it's not 40 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. Rather, it's 40 years after the establishment, after they built the Mishkan, which would really be 41 years after they left Egypt. And if you interpret it that way, that also can make sense. And we can say that Rosh Hashana is Tishrei and not Nisan. Once again, Bishlema Heich Bish lemahech, the pasuk that's talking about Aharon, mefaresh Yetziat Mitzrayim. I understand it's 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Elahai, but the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu says that he addressed them after 40 years, Vahi be'arba'im shanan, it was after 40 years in the 11th month that Moshe Rabbeinu addressed them. Mimai del Yetziat Mitzrayim. Who says that pasuk has to be referring to 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim? Dilma lehakamat Mishkan. Perhaps it's 40 years from when the Mishkan was established, which would make it the 41st year. Kede'ama Rav Papa, so the Gemara answers like Rav Papa. Shenat Esrim, it says in Melachim, Shenat Esrim legzeira shava. When it says 20 years, it's a gezeira shava. When it says in one place 20 years of the reign of a king, the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, so too, when it says in another place 20 years, we understand that to mean 20 years of the reign of Artaxerxes. So too over here, when it says 40 years, because in one place it's talking about 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim, so too in another place when it mentions 40 years, when it mentions 40 years by Moshe Rabbeinu, even though it doesn't say it's 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim, but since it's already said that by Aharon HaKohen, when it says over there by Aharon explicitly 40 years from when Am Yisrael left Egypt, so too when it says 40 years in the pasuk by Moshe Rabbeinu, we make a gezerah shava that it's the same, and it's also referring to 40 years from when they left Egypt. Ma kan letziat Mitzrayim, af kan letziat Mitzrayim. Umimai, the Gemara asks another question. Umimai de maaseh de av kadim. Why are we assuming that Aharon HaKohen passed away in the month of Av happened before Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat? Perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, and Aharon passed away in the following Av, not in the Av before. He passed away in the Av after Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel. Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat. We are assuming that Aharon passed away in the Av before Shevat. That's why Tishrei can't be Rosh Hashana, because if Tishrei was Rosh Hashana, that would put them into two separate years. And the pasuk clearly states that Aharon passed away in the 40th year, and Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in his speech in the 40th year. Maybe Aharon passed away in the Av after Shevat, and in that way we can say that Rosh Hashanah is not Nisan. We'll say that Rosh Hashanah is in the month that the first of the year is the month of Tishrei, and it still makes sense because the beginning of the calendar year will be the month of Tishrei. Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, and Aaron passed away in the month of Av. We only have a problem in saying that Tishrei is the beginning of the year if we know that Aharon passed away in the 40th year and Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the 40th year. If you say that the beginning of the calendar year is Tishrei, and we're assuming that Aharon passed away before Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel. Therefore, we have to say that the beginning of the calendar year is Nisan, and therefore Aharon passed away in the month of Av before Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat. But perhaps Aharon passed away in the month of Av after Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, and we can say that the beginning of the year is not Echad Ben Nisan, rather it is Echad Ben Tishrei. Dilma Masei de Shevat Kadim. Perhaps the month of Shevat comes. Perhaps this that Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel in the month of Shevat, that happened before Aharon passed away in the month of Av, in the coming month of Av. Lo salkadaitach. Don't say that. Dichtiv. Why? It says in the pasuk, when did Moshe Rabbeinu address Bnei Israel with his speech? Acharei hakoto et Sichon. After he killed Sichon. V'chi nach nafshei deharon akati have Sichon kayam. When Aharon passed away, Sichon was still alive. When Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel with his speech in the month of Shevat, it's Acharei hakoto, after he had killed Sichon. So if we assume that Aharon passed away in the month of Av that comes after Shevat, well, if Aharon passed away in the month of Av that comes after Shevat, Sichon was still alive. V'chinach nafshe de Aharon, when Aharon passed away, Akati have Sichon kayam. Sichon was still alive. Dichtiv, Vayishma HaKenaani Melech Arad, the king of Canaan, Vayishma HaKenaani Melech Arad, the Kenaani, the king of Arad, heard. Mashmu'ah, what did he hear? Mashmu'ah Shama Shemet Aharon. He heard that Aharon passed away. Venistaleku Ananei HaKavod, and the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory, the clouds that were protecting Bnei Israel, they left, they departed from Am Yisrael. V'kasavu, and he took that as a sign. He thought, Nitna reshut leilachem beYisrael. Therefore, now he has permission to go to war with Am Yisrael. So that means at the time that Aharon passed away, the king of Sichon, we're going to see Vayishma Kenani Melech Arad. Who's Melech Arad? That is Sichon. At the time that Aharon passed away, Sichon was still alive. However, we know that Sichon was already killed before Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Israel. If Sichon was alive at the time when Aharon passed away, but he was already killed when Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech, it must be that Aharon passed away in the Av before Shevat, and therefore if Aharon passed away in the Av before Shevat, we are forced to say that the beginning of the year is Nisan and not the month of Tishrei, because if it's the month of Tishrei, we can't say Arba'im Shana by when Aharon passed away, and we can't say Arba'im Shana when Moshe addressed Bnei Israel. It's going to have to be the 41st year. So once again, now that we know, if Sichon was alive when Aharon passed away, but he was already killed when Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Yisrael, it has to be that Aharon passed away in the Av before the Shevat that Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Yisrael. And we know that Aharon passed away in the 40th year, and Moshe Rabbeinu addressed Bnei Yisrael in the 40th year. It must be that Nisan is the beginning of the year and not Tishrei, because if Tishrei was the beginning of the year, and Aharon had to be, and Sichon had to be dead by the time Moshe Rabbeinu started his speech, because Sichon was still alive at the time that Aharon passed away, but he was dead when Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech. It must be that we're talking about the Av before Tishrei and not the Av after Tishrei. V'hainu dirtiv. How do we know that the Ananei HaKavod left Bnei Israel? Vayir'u kol ha'edah ki gava Aharon. Aharon had perished. V'amar Rabbi Abahu al tikre vayir'u. Don't read it as vayiru ela vayera'u. They were seen. They were able to be seen, meaning the Ananei HaKavod left them, and now they were exposed. Kedirish Lakish. Damarish Lakish mishamesh bedalad leshono. Damarish Lakish ki. The word ki, meshamesh, can be used in 4 different ways. It could be used as if, dilma, maybe, ella, but, deha, because. Vayiru kol hada ki gava Aharon. Vayera'u kol hada, the entire edah could be seen. Why? Ki, because Aharon perished. What does it mean because Aharon perished? They no longer had the zechut of Aharon HaKohen, and therefore the Ananei HaKavod left them, and now they were exposed. Mi dami. How can you bring a proof from there? Hatam Kenaan HaChasichon. That pasuk is talking about Canaan. We're talking about Sichon. Tana hu Sichon hu Arad hu Canaan. Sichon is Arad is Canaan. Why? How? Sichon shedome lesayach Sichon. Why do we call him Sichon? He's compared to a coal in the desert. Shedome lesayach bamidbar. Canaan. Why do we refer to him as a Kenaani? Hashem Malchuto, because he was the king. Because of where he was king. Uma Shemo, but what was his real name? Arad Shemo. His real name was Arad. Ika damli. There are those that read it slightly differently, that they read this slightly differently. Agad shedomel le'arod bamidbar. What does it mean, agad? Agad is because he resembled a wild donkey in the desert. Kenaan al shem malchuto. Why do we refer to him as a Kenani? Because of where he was king. Uma Shemo, that was the name of his kingdom. Uma Shemo, what was his real name? Sichon was his real name. In any case, we see from here that Sichon was alive at the time that Aharon passed away. However, he was already killed by Moshe Rabbeinu before Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech. So it's impossible that Aharon passed away after Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech, because Sichon was alive at the time that Aharon passed away, but he already was killed by Moshe Rabbeinu before beginning his speech. So it has to be that the death of Aharon happened in the Av before Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech in Shevat. Now that we know that it has to be the Av before Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech in Shevat, and not the Av after Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech in Shevat, it's impossible to say that the beginning of the year is Tishrei. It has to be Nisan, because if the beginning of the year is Tishrei, it's going to turn out that Aharon passed away in the 40th year, and Moshe Rabbeinu began his speech in the 41st year. But by the death of Aharon and the speech of Moshe, it says by both of them 40 years, 40 years. So it can't be that the beginning of the year is Tishrei. It has to be that the beginning of the year is Nisan. Bezrat Hashem, Rabotai, we will continue tomorrow with Gimel Amud Aleph.